If I could reach back in time, if I could change water to wine.
All right, so Matt, when we last left off, the doors of opportunity opened for us in LA. We passed. Those doors then shut. And so tell me, what happened next on this road to Gray Music Factory?
What happened after that was kind of, I think life happened. Steve had a very lucrative career. I mean, it was really something to envy. He was working for the companies. It was like, these were the household names. And
Netscape, eBay, PayPal, Apple.
Yeah. And he was very high ranking in those companies. Now because I'd been in the Silicon Valley with Steve, I also went into the computer industry, but I did that from Los Angeles, which was a great boon for me too. I landed in the right place and I ended up having a nice career there. Also, we would see each other at least a couple of times a year because we share a person, which is his brother, Joe. Joe's my best friend, along with Steve.
And Joe happened to live in L.A.
And Joe lived in, and still does.
And still does.
Where I do. And Steve is still up here where we are in San Jose, Milpitas. But when we would get together, what always happened was we would start the socializing, having the dinner, sitting around and talking. And the next thing that would happen is the guitar would be found. Steve and I would slowly find ourselves creeping off into a corner by ourselves, and we would start writing really away from everybody. This was not a social event. We had to be in our own little world. And this seemed to happen wherever we were, wherever we went. Every time we got together, we would write a song. And it was really magic because that's what we loved doing together. That and joking and laughing, which we did just as much. But then it was around 2002, I had started writing again. I was coming up with little ditties and things and some song ideas that were really getting me motivated. I didn't know what Steve was doing. And as it turned out, his brother Joe had one of these get-togethers. And Steve was there. And I almost didn't want to bother Steve about how motivated I was to write again. And Steve happened to approach me. And Steve, tell him what happened next.
Well, what happened was my little kids, my little girls turned into teenagers, and in this very room that we're sitting now, which used to be filled with their toys, and my instruments were all kind of squirreled away, that all the instruments were back. I was building up the studio, and I was aching to get recording again. Teenagers didn't expect as much time from Dad, and
they were becoming independent,
and my time was coming back to me. And where did I go? I went straight to my instruments. I built up the studio, and I thought it's time to start recording. So next time I see Matt, going to hit him up. We're going to come up with a bunch of songs, and we're going to do an album.
And it was perfect timing. I had been writing verses and choruses and things, very lyrically driven, very melody driven. Steve had been coming up with just magnificent chord structures and ideas.
Yeah, it was a fun time in my life. My career was taking the majority of my time, but I needed that escape, and this was my great escape.
And we were still working steps. It wasn't like we could do this full time or anything. And Steve would actually, in this studio, he would work on them and produce them. We couldn't be overly prolific.
We couldn't move fast as we wanted
because we still had careers.
So during that time that we just talked about here, 10 or 12 songs came out that Matt and I were actually pretty excited about. I had them in my studio. I had done recordings of it. I could share them with friends and with everybody, and we were both pretty excited about the songs. I was perfectly happy at that point to continue recording.
But then Steve retires. And this is part of the story of how we finally get to here. But this is the story of what happened between the doors closing in Los Angeles and coming up to where the idea of Gray Music Factory happens. And on our next chapter is going to be called Ari. If you liked anything you've heard here, if you enjoy listening to us rant on about the old days, give us a like. You know it really helps the YouTube algorithm. If you'd like to follow us, we're going to keep coming up with content. Any comments below, please let us know. We read them all. So, until next time.
Till next time. See you.
Say good night, Gracie.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Your heart would be mine if I could reach back in time. Years of time, miles in space, still the bookmark has not lost its place. If I could reach back in time, yeah.
Brought to you by Ben Crandall's Bitter Apples. They're cheap because they taste just awful. That's Ben Crandall's Bitter Apples when you can't afford the good ones.